A fundamental question we're always asked as believers is that, did Jesus really claim to be God? That's a really important question. So when we look into the New Testament documents, we have to divide that question into two parts. One is the question of whether Jesus himself ever claimed to be God, and the second question is, did the New Testament writers present Jesus as God, or did the New Testament writers think Jesus was God? So those are distinguishable questions. And the answer to both those questions is actually yes. Not only does Jesus present himself as God, but the New Testament writers also plainly present him as God. And that's exactly why the church throughout the ages has believed in the divinity of Jesus, because you have both those very powerful testimonies telling you that he's divine. Now, as far as Jesus' own claims, people are often hung up on this idea that, well, wait a second, if Jesus was God, why didn't he say it more? If Jesus was God, why didn't he go around saying, hey, everybody, I'm God, and say it all the time like that? But that type of objection really misses the mark. Just because Jesus was God doesn't mean he had to say it in this overt, direct way all the time. Jesus' claim to divinity was often done in what we might call a very Jewish way, a way that links him to the Old Testament and sets him in the context of the Old Testament flow of narrative, or the Old Testament narrative of redemptive history. Now, of course, Jesus does sometimes directly say he's God. In the Gospel of John, for example, in John chapter 8, Jesus takes on and invokes the divine name of Yahweh, I am. Jesus also claims divinity in other ways beyond this, through his miracles. Jesus, in particular, does miracles that distinctively position himself as the God of the Old Testament. His calming of the wind and the waves, for example, on the Sea of Galilee is an example of how he takes up the attributes of the Old Testament God, and there's a number of links to God doing this very thing in Old Testament settings. And one last example here is the Transfiguration. Jesus presents himself as glorified, as in bright light, having the Shekinah glory cloud of the God of the Old Testament. So even in the Synoptics, Jesus is presenting himself as God. And we find all of that confirmed in the simple fact that the other New Testament writers make the same point about Jesus. So Jesus not only claims it for himself, but we see in a number of New Testament writers, very early, they view Jesus as fully divine. The clearest example of this is Paul himself. Philippians 2, the famous hem of Christology there. Jesus is portrayed as Yahweh. Every knee will bow to Christ. That's an Old Testament reference about how every knee bows to God himself. So there's no doubt that Paul, at a very early time, viewed Jesus as divine. Paul was drawing on earlier traditions about Jesus being divine that go probably back even to the very beginning of the church in the 40s of the first century. And of course, Jesus himself claimed to be divine. And when you look at that entire package, there's little doubt that Christians can be confident that Jesus, in fact, is God in the flesh.